This presentation contains descriptions of a fatal car crash and discusses sensitive topics including death and alleged conspiracies. Viewer discretion is advised. The last thing she ever saw was a blinding flash of light. A percussive metallic scream of tearing steel echoed through the narrow tunnel, a sound so violent it seemed to rip the very fabric of the night. Then an unnatural silence punctuated only by the drip of engine fluid and the faint, almost predatory clicks of camera shutters. On the floor of the mangled Mercedes, surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be a getaway car, Princess Diana was still conscious. A photographer who had been chasing her just moments before was now leaning through her shattered window. Through the haze of pain and confusion, she managed to whisper four words that would become the final haunting question mark on her life. "My God, what's happened?" The world was told it was a tragic accident. A drunk driver, a high-speed chase, a deadly combination of recklessness and fame. It's a simple, clean narrative. But what if the story we were all told is a lie? What if the crash wasn't an accident at all? Because 10 months before the Pont de l'Alma tunnel became her tomb, Princess Diana took a pen and wrote a letter. A letter she gave to her butler for safekeeping. A letter that reads like a prophecy of her own death. In it, she named a specific individual and accused them of planning an accident in her car. Her words were chillingly specific: brake failure and serious head injury. She believed this was being done to clear the path for Prince Charles to remarry. Was this the paranoid fantasy of a troubled woman? Or was it the most important clue in a murder investigation that never happened? This is the question that sits at the heart of the story. Because to understand what happened on that night in Paris, you first have to understand the woman Diana had become in the summer of 1997. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. The divorce from Prince Charles the year before had stripped her of the title, a petty but painful cut from the family that had defined, and in many ways confined her for 15 years. But in losing her royal status, she gained something far more powerful: her freedom. She was Diana, Princess of Wales, but now on her own terms. She was a global humanitarian force, walking through minefields in Angola, comforting AIDS patients in London, and commanding the world's attention with a single compassionate gaze. She was the most famous, most photographed, most obsessed over woman on the planet. A living icon, and yet, a woman profoundly alone, navigating a new life under the relentless glare of the public eye. The press, which had once been her ally in her fairy tale, had become her predator. They weren't just reporters, they were a global industry worth billions, and Diana was its most valuable asset. Every photo of her was worth a fortune. A picture of her on the phone? $50,000. A picture of her in a swimsuit? $500,000. They weren't just taking her picture, they were hunting her. They followed her every move, staked out her home, bribed her friends, and used long-range lenses to peer into her private moments. It was a suffocating, never-ending siege. She was a prisoner of her own fame, and she was desperately searching for an escape. And in the summer of 1997, it seemed she might have found one. His name was Dodi Fayed. He was the son of Mohammed Al Fayed, the flamboyant billionaire owner of Harrods department store in London and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Dodi was a film producer with a playboy reputation, but to Diana, he represented something new. He was outside the stiff, cold world of the British aristocracy. He was warm, attentive, and he could offer her a level of security and luxury that even royalty couldn't match. That July, Dodi invited Diana and her sons, William and Harry, to vacation with him on his family's superyacht, the Jonnacle, in the south of France. For Diana, it was a glimpse of a different life. Days were spent in the sun on jet skis, far from the gray skies and colder palaces of England. The boys were happy. She was relaxed. For the first time in a long time, she looked genuinely joyful. After the boys returned to their father, Diana flew back to the Jonnacle to spend more time with Dodi. And that's when the paparazzi found them. The hunt was on. A fleet of small boats, packed with photographers armed with telephoto lenses, surrounded the yacht day and night. They were like sharks circling their prey. It was on this trip that one of them, an Italian photographer, snapped the picture that would be seen by billions. The kiss. A grainy long-lens shot of Diana and Dodi embracing on the deck. The photo sold for an estimated $3 million. It was proof of the romance the world had been speculating about, but it also threw gasoline on the fire. The price on Diana's head skyrocketed. The chase became more frantic, more aggressive, more dangerous. Their idyllic vacation turned into a frantic island-hopping tour across the Mediterranean, trying and failing to outrun the media pack. They were hounded from Sardinia to the coast of Italy. Every time the Jonquil pulled into a port, a swarm of cameras was waiting. The romance that had begun as a private escape was now a global spectacle. By the end of August, they were exhausted. They decided to fly to Paris for one final, quiet night together before Diana returned to London to see her sons. On Saturday, August 30th, their private jet touched down at Le Bourget Airport just outside Paris. But there was nothing quiet about their arrival. The paparazzi were waiting. A convoy of motorcycles and cars, driven by aggressive freelance photographers known as the Paps, immediately gave chase. Their planned romantic dinner at a chic bistro was impossible. They were trapped. Their only sanctuary was the Ritz Hotel, the five-star fortress owned by Dodi's father. They arrived at the hotel, swarmed by cameras and shouting reporters. Inside, they tried to have dinner at the hotel's two-Michelin-star restaurant, but the stares of the other patrons were just as intrusive as the cameras outside. They retreated to the privacy of the Imperial Suite, but they couldn't stay there forever. Diana had to get back to London. They needed a plan to escape the hotel without being followed. The plan was a decoy. Dodi's usual Mercedes, with his regular driver, would leave from the front of the Ritz, leading the bulk of the paparazzi on a wild goose chase. Meanwhile, Diana and Dodi would slip out the back entrance, the Rue Cambon, and get into a different car. A black Mercedes S280, sent over from a sister company. Seemed like a solid plan. A classic bait and switch. At the wheel of this second Mercedes was a man named Henri Paul. He was the hotel's acting head of security. He wasn't a professional chauffeur, and he hadn't expected to be driving that night. Joining them was Trevor Rhys-Jones, a former British paratrooper and a member of the Fayed family's protection team. He was the only one who would put on his seatbelt. Just after midnight, at 20 minutes past 12 on the morning of August 31st, the plan was put into motion. Diana, Dodi, and their bodyguard slipped out the back door. They climbed into the waiting Mercedes. Henri Paul got behind the wheel, looked at the handful of determined paparazzi who hadn't fallen for the decoy, and smiled. He gunned the engine. The car shot away from the curb, tires squealing as it accelerated into the sleeping streets of Paris, heading directly for the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The chase was on, and in less than 3 minutes, everything would be over. The Mercedes S280 screamed through the Place de la Concorde, a silver bullet tearing through the heart of a sleeping city. Behind it, a swarm of motorcycles and scooters, a pack of wolves on 2 wheels, their camera flashes stabbing the darkness like machine gun fire. This wasn't a chase, it was a hunt. Inside the car, the air was thick with adrenaline. Trevor Rhys-Jones, the bodyguard in the front passenger seat, was the only one wearing a seatbelt. He would later say he had no memory of the final terrifying moments. In the back, Dodi Fayed and Princess Diana were sealed in the leather and walnut luxury of the rear cabin, a gilded cage hurtling toward its fate. The man at the wheel, Henri Paul, was the acting head of security at the Ritz. He was a man with secrets. On paper, he was a competent professional, but in the minutes before he got behind the wheel, he'd been seen taunting the paparazzi, almost daring them to follow. "Don't bother trying to keep up," he reportedly bragged. "You won't catch us." Was it bravado? Or something else? The official investigation would later conclude his blood alcohol level was more than 3 times the legal limit in France. A drunk driver, a simple, tragic explanation, but we'll soon discover that even this, the very foundation of the official story, is built on shifting sand. The speedometer needle climbed. 100 kilometers per hour. 120. 150. They were flying down the Cours la Reine, a riverside expressway. To their right, the Seine flowed silently, a dark ribbon oblivious to the drama unfolding on its banks. The paparazzi, some riding to a bike, pushed their engines to the limit, jockeying for position, desperate for the money shot, the photo that would be worth millions. They were so close you could almost feel the heat from their engines, see the grim determination in their eyes through the glare of their own flashes. Henri Paul was driving erratically, weaving to shake them, but for every move he made, the pack adjusted, staying right on his tail. He was a pilot, a man trained to handle pressure in the air. But this was different. This was a ground-level dogfight, and he was out of his element. He made a decision. Instead of continuing along the river, he aimed the car for the mouth of the Pont de El Alma underpass, a short, direct tunnel, a place where he could, perhaps, finally lose them in the enclosed space, using the car's superior power to rocket out the other side and disappear into the night. It was a gamble, a fatal one. As the Mercedes plunged from the open air into the sodium yellow glare of the tunnel, the world outside vanished. The roar of the engine was amplified, echoing off the concrete walls. The flashes of the cameras ricocheted, creating a blinding, disorienting strobe effect. For a split second, they were inside a kaleidoscope of light and noise, and it's in this split second that everything went wrong. Just ahead, inside the tunnel, there was another vehicle, a slow-moving white Fiat Uno. It was in the right-hand lane, puttering along at a fraction of the Mercedes' speed. Eyewitnesses would later describe it. They described the driver, the smoke coming from its exhaust. They described the sudden, violent way the Mercedes had to react. Henri Paul swerved left hard to avoid a direct collision. The heavy sedan scraped against the side of the Fiat, a screech of metal on metal, a shower of sparks and white paint. But the maneuver was too much, too fast. The laws of physics are absolute. At that speed, the car was no longer a vehicle under his command. It was a projectile. He lost control. The back end of the Mercedes fishtailed, and for a horrifying instant, the car was sliding sideways down the tunnel. Trevor Rees-Jones in the front seat saw it coming. A solid, unmoving concrete pillar, holding up the bridge above. The 13th pillar. There was no time to scream. The impact was apocalyptic. A single deafening explosion of sound. A symphony of destruction composed of twisting steel, shattering glass, and the instantaneous, brutal stop of all momentum. The front of the 2-ton Mercedes crumpled like a tin can, the engine driven back into the passenger compartment. The car spun violently, hitting the wall of the tunnel with its rear before finally coming to a rest, facing the wrong way, shrouded in a cloud of steam and dust. And then silence. A heavy, profound silence that lasted only a moment before it was pierced by the sound of the car's horn, stuck on and blaring a continuous, mournful cry into the wreckage. The first of the paparazzi arrived seconds later, but they didn't rush to help. They didn't call for an ambulance. They raised their cameras. Flash, flash, flash. They photographed the twisted metal. They photographed the dying and the dead. One photographer, Romuald Rat, would later describe opening the rear door of the car. He saw Diana. Her eyes were open. She was conscious. He said she turned her head, saw the carnage in the front of the car, and whispered, "Oh my God." Then she went into cardiac arrest. The scene inside the tunnel was one of utter devastation. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed instantly. Their bodies were broken. Their lives extinguished in the same millisecond the car hit the pillar. Trevor Rees-Jones was alive, but barely. His face was shattered, the dashboard having crushed his jaw and facial bones. And Diana, she was slumped on the floor in the back, critically injured but alive. For nearly an hour, she would remain trapped in the mangled wreckage as emergency services struggled to extract her. An hour that would become one of the most controversial and debated aspects of this entire story. But as the first responders worked frantically and the paparazzi documented every gruesome detail, the other car, the white Fiat Uno, was gone. It had vanished from the scene. It was as if it had been a ghost. But it wasn't. It left behind evidence. Scrapes of white paint on the mangled black body of the Mercedes. Broken pieces of its own tail light littering the tunnel floor. Multiple eyewitnesses saw it speed away, its driver never even looking back. This is the moment the story splits in two. On one side, you have the official narrative. A tragic accident caused by a drunk driver and a reckless paparazzi chase. A story that is simple, clean, and places the blame squarely on Henri Paul and the press. But on the other side, a darker, more complex possibility begins to emerge. A possibility that hinges on this mysterious second vehicle. Who was driving that Fiat Uno? Why did they never come forward? Was their presence in the tunnel at that exact moment a coincidence? Or was it something else entirely? Was the little white car a random obstacle? Or was it a weapon deliberately placed to force the Mercedes off its path and into that 13th pillar? The official investigation would try to find it, but the car and its driver would become the central ghosts in this machine. A mystery that, for some, proves this was no accident at all. They believe the Fiat Uno was the trigger, the key to a professionally executed assassination. the French police launched a massive manhunt. Over 3,000 Fiat Uno owners in the region were questioned. The car was a common, inexpensive model, a needle in a nationwide haystack. But investigators had a crucial clue: the paint. The flecks left on the Mercedes weren't just from any white Fiat Uno. They were from a specific model, painted a specific shade of white, Bianco Corfu 224, used on Unos built between 1983 and 1987. This narrowed the search, but only slightly. The mystery driver and his car had vanished as if into thin air. For the official investigation, the Fiat Uno was a loose end, a frustrating but ultimately secondary detail in a drunk driving accident. But for others, particularly for Mohammed Al Fayed, Dodi's devastated father, this phantom car wasn't a loose end. It was the beginning of the thread. He was convinced that the collision wasn't an accident intended to slow the Mercedes down, but a deliberate act of aggression. A move designed to destabilize the car, forcing it into the path of the 13th pillar. Al Fayed, a billionaire with near-limitless resources, launched his own private investigation, hiring former intelligence officers and forensic experts to uncover what he believed was the truth. And their investigation soon zeroed in on one man, a French press photographer named Jean-Paul, who went by the name James Ananson. Ananson was a well-known paparazzo. He was part of the pack, one of the many photographers who made a living chasing celebrities. And he owned a white Fiat Uno, a 1987 model. The right color, the right year. It was a tantalizing lead. When questioned by police, Ananson had an alibi. He said he'd been at his home in Lignières, about a 4-hour drive from Paris, on the night of the crash. His wife corroborated his story. He claimed to have sold his Fiat Uno in October of 1997, just a few weeks after the crash, saying it was old and had high mileage. The car was later found, and investigators examined it. They found it had been repainted, and its taillight had been replaced. The new owner said Ananson told him he'd had a minor prank in a parking lot. On the surface, it seemed plausible. Coincidence? But Al Fayed's investigators dug deeper, and the story of James Ananson started to unravel, revealing a man who was far more than just a simple photographer. They discovered that Ananson was known for bragging about his connections to intelligence services. He'd allegedly told colleagues he worked as an informant for MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, and the French equivalent, the DGSE. He was a man who moved in shadowy circles, a man who, according to some, carried multiple passports and had access to information far beyond the reach of a typical paparazzi. Suddenly, the white Fiat Uno wasn't just a random car. It was potentially a tool used by a trained operative. The theory proposed by Al Fayed's team was chilling. Ananson, acting on orders from intelligence agencies, was tasked with intercepting the Mercedes. His job was to block or bump the car, creating a crash that would either kill the occupants or, at the very least, serve as a terrifying warning to Diana and Dodi to end their relationship. They pointed to Andanson's unusual wealth. For a freelance photographer, he lived an extravagant lifestyle, owning multiple properties and expensive cars. Where was the money coming from? Was it from selling photos? Or was he being paid for other, more clandestine services? The most damning piece of evidence, for those who believe the conspiracy, came from Andanson's own movements. While he claimed to be at home, toll booth records and cell phone data suggested he might have been much closer to Paris than he admitted. Some witnesses from the Alma tunnel, when shown a photo of Ananson, said he bore a resemblance to the driver they saw, a man with glasses and a European appearance. The case against him was circumstantial, but the pieces were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Here was a man with the right car, a questionable alibi, a history of intelligence connections, and a potential motive to be involved. But before French authorities could fully investigate these new, explosive claims, James Andanson's story took a final horrific turn. In May of 2000, nearly 3 years after the crash, his body was found in the French countryside. He was inside his burned-out BMW, in a remote, locked Ministry of Defense forest. The official verdict was suicide. The police report stated that Ananson, allegedly depressed over personal matters, had driven to the woods, poured gasoline over himself and the car, and lit a match. Tragic but straightforward end. Except the details were anything but straightforward. Andanson's friends and family insisted he was not suicidal. He had plans for the future. He was excited about upcoming projects. Then there was the scene itself. The car was locked from the outside. The keys were missing, and the coroner's report contained a truly bizarre finding. There were 2 holes in Anderson's head in his left temple. The official explanation was that the intense heat of the fire had caused his skull to explode in 2 distinct places. But to forensic experts hired by Fayed, this was ludicrous. They argued the holes were consistent with bullet entry and exit wounds. They believed James Anderson had been assassinated, shot twice in the head, then placed in his car and set ablaze to destroy the evidence. Professional hit. A cleanup operation. The timing was also deeply suspicious. Anderson died just as a new book was about to be published, one that was set to publicly name him as the driver of the Fiat Uno and link him to the intelligence services. It seemed that just as the spotlight was about to be turned on him, his light was permanently extinguished. Was this the ultimate proof of a conspiracy? Was James Anderson the secret agent sent to intercept Diana, who was then silenced by his own handlers before he could ever talk? Did he know too much? The official narrative dismisses all of this. They maintain Anderson was a troubled man who took his own life. They argue the evidence linking him to the tunnel is weak, based on hearsay and the desperate theories of a grieving father. They claim his so-called intelligence connections were nothing more than the boastful lies of a man trying to seem more important than he was. His repainted Fiat Uno? Just a guy fixing up an old car to sell it. The holes in his head? A gruesome but natural phenomenon of extreme heat. To them, Anderson is a red herring, a tragic footnote in the story whose death has been twisted to fit a narrative. But for millions around the world, the death of James Anderson is the keystone in the arch of the assassination plot. It's too convenient, too neat. A man with the perfect car, a secret life, and a death that defies simple explanation. If he wasn't the driver, why did he die in such a brutal and mysterious way right when his name was about to be dragged into the biggest news story on the planet? If he was just a simple photographer, why did his death look so much like the final scene of a spy movie? The mystery of the white Fiat Uno had led investigators to a man of shadows, and his death plunged them into an even deeper darkness. It raised the terrifying possibility that this wasn't just about a rogue photographer. It suggested the involvement of powerful, shadowy organizations who could not only orchestrate a crash in the heart of Paris, but could also silence anyone who got in their way, leaving nothing but scorched earth and unanswered questions. The focus of the conspiracy now shifted from a single car to the powerful institutions James and Anderson claimed to work for, the world's most elite and ruthless intelligence agencies. And so the search for answers turned away from the chaotic streets of Paris and toward the quiet, sterile corridors of power in London, Langley, and Tel Aviv. The names whispered were no longer just paparazzi, but the clandestine services of nations, Britain's MI6, America's CIA, and Israel's Mossad. These are organizations that operate in the shadows, that topple governments and shape history with unseen hands. But the question that hung in the air, thick and suffocating, was why? Why would the most powerful spies on Earth target a princess? The answer, according to those who believe the conspiracy, is twofold. It involves a threat to a global multi-billion-dollar industry, and a threat to the very heart of a 1,000-year-old monarchy. First, the landmines. In the final year of her life, Princess Diana had found a new, powerful voice. She was no longer just a fashion icon or a royal outcast. She had become a global humanitarian crusader. Her chosen cause was the complete and total ban of anti-personnel landmines. This wasn't a soft, feel-good charity. This was a direct confrontation with one of the most powerful and profitable lobbies on the planet, the international arms industry. Diana wasn't just attending galas. She was walking through active minefields in Angola and Bosnia, holding maimed children in her arms for the world's cameras to see. She was a walking, talking, endlessly photogenic public relations nightmare for weapons manufacturers. Her fame was a superweapon. When she spoke, the world listened, and she was calling their product a scourge on the face of the earth. She met with politicians, she lobbied governments, and just weeks before her death, she was set to deliver a keynote address at a major anti-landmine conference. To the arms dealers and the governments that protected them, Diana was more than a nuisance. She was, in the words of one British defense minister, a loose cannon, a dangerously unpredictable force interfering in matters of state security and international commerce. The global landmine trade was worth billions. These weapons were manufactured and sold by companies with deep ties to Western governments and their intelligence agencies. By attacking the landmine industry, Diana wasn't just threatening corporate profits. She was threatening a cornerstone of the military-industrial complex. She was pulling at a thread that could unravel a very lucrative and very dark tapestry of global power. Was it a big enough motive for murder? For some, it was more than enough. But it was the second threat, the one that was far more personal, that many believe sealed her fate. That threat had a name: Dodi Fayed. Their summer romance in 1997 was the biggest story in the world. But to the British establishment, it was an unfolding catastrophe. Dodi wasn't just a wealthy playboy. He was the son of Mohammed Al-Fayed, an Egyptian Muslim businessman who was, to put it mildly, a thorn in the side of the British elite. He was seen as an outsider, an upstart who had bought his way into British high society, but would never truly be a part of it. Now, his son was in a serious relationship with the mother of the future King of England. Imagine the implications. Prince William, the second in line to the throne, could soon have a Muslim stepfather. The tabloids were already running rampant with speculation about marriage. This wasn't just a matter of royal protocol or public image. It was an existential threat to the identity of the monarchy itself. The British monarch is not just a head of state, they are the supreme governor of the Church of England. The idea of the mother of the king being married to a man from an Egyptian Muslim family was, to the old guard, simply unthinkable. It struck at the very foundations of the crown. And then came the most explosive allegation of all, the one that, if true, would provide the most powerful motive imaginable. Mohammed Al-Fayed has always insisted, with every fiber of his being, that Princess Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child when she died. Think about that for a moment. A Muslim half-sibling for the future King of England, a child that would forever tie the British royal bloodline to the Fayed family. To the establishment, this would not have been a scandal. It would have been an apocalypse. Mohammed Al-Fayed claims that Dodi had bought an engagement ring in Paris just hours before the crash, and that the couple was planning to announce their engagement and the pregnancy upon their return to London. He points to security camera footage of Dodi at a jeweler that day. He points to conversations Diana allegedly had with close friends, hinting at a wonderful surprise. The official story, of course, denies this completely. The post-mortem examination found no evidence of pregnancy. But this is where the story takes another dark turn. Why was Diana's body embalmed in France so quickly after her death? Embalming is not a standard practice in the United Kingdom. The process involves flushing the circulatory system with chemicals, including formaldehyde, which would make any conclusive pregnancy test on the blood impossible. French authorities said it was done for public health reasons, to allow for a viewing of the body. But Diana's own family had not requested it. To conspiracy theorists, this wasn't a sanitary precaution. It was the deliberate destruction of evidence. The single most important piece of forensic evidence, the truth of whether or not a new heir was on the way, was chemically obliterated within hours of her death. A rogue princess, a global campaign against the arms trade, an unacceptable Muslim lover, and a potential pregnancy that would shake the monarchy to its core. The motives were there. They were powerful and they were terrifying. But motive is nothing without method. How could a state intelligence agency actually pull this off? The answer to that question came from a man who claimed he knew their playbook because he used to be one of them. His name is Richard Tomlinson. He is a former officer for MI6, Britain's elite foreign intelligence service, the real-life agency of James Bond. Tomlinson was dismissed from the service and later imprisoned for attempting to publish a book about his career, a violation of Britain's Official Secrets Act. He was, by all accounts, a disgruntled ex-spy. But what he had to say would send shockwaves through the investigation into Diana's death. Tomlinson swore under oath that he had seen a document during his time at MI6 that detailed a plan to assassinate a foreign leader. The target was Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, and the proposed method was chillingly familiar. The plan was to stage a car crash in a tunnel. The plot specifically detailed using a powerful strobe light, a flash gun, to blind the driver, causing them to lose control and crash at high speed. It was designed to look like a tragic accident, a drunk driving incident perhaps, leaving MI6 with perfect deniability. Staged crash. In a tunnel. Using a blinding flash of light. The parallels to what happened in the Ponte El Alma tunnel were impossible to ignore. Tomlinson even named the MI6 agent who he claimed had drafted the proposal, the same agent who was also known to be active in Paris around the time of Diana's death. When Tomlinson came forward with this information, the British government went into overdrive to discredit him. They painted him as a fantasist, a traitor, a liar making up stories for personal gain. They fought tooth and nail to prevent him from testifying at the official inquest into Diana's death. But his testimony couldn't be completely erased. Here was a trained intelligence officer, an insider, describing a specific assassination protocol that mirrored the death of Princess Diana in almost every single detail. Was it a stunning coincidence? Or was Richard Tomlinson pulling back the curtain, giving the world a horrifying glimpse of how the secret state eliminates its enemies? The official story had a simple explanation for the crash, but Tomlinson had provided a blueprint for a perfect murder. And once that blueprint was out in the open, every official explanation, every simple answer, would be held up to a new and far more sinister light. With that single explosive allegation, the official story began to fracture. It wasn't just a crack, it was a schism, because Richard Tomlinson hadn't just offered a theory. He had handed the world a vocabulary for doubt. Suddenly, every strange detail, every unanswered question, had a place to fit within a darker, more organized narrative. The strobe light, the tunnel, the staged accident, it was all there. And one man more than any other was ready to pick up that blueprint and wage war with it. That man was Mohammed Al-Fayed. To understand what happened next, you have to understand Al-Fayed. He wasn't just a grieving father. He was a self-made Egyptian billionaire, the flamboyant owner of Harrods department store and the Ritz Hotel in Paris. He was an outsider who had spent decades desperately trying and failing to claw his way into the British establishment. They had denied him citizenship, mocked his accent, and viewed him as new money. He saw their snobbery and their silent, suffocating rules as a personal affront. And he believed that same establishment, that same royal family, had never truly accepted Diana after her divorce, and they certainly would never accept his son, Dodi, as her partner. In the initial months after the crash, Al-Fayed was consumed by grief. But as the French investigation focused squarely on a drunk driver and reckless paparazzi, his grief began to curdle into suspicion, and then into outright fury. He didn't just believe the official story was wrong. He believed it was a lie. A deliberate, calculated lie designed to protect the most powerful family on earth. And so Mohammed Al-Fayed unleashed the full, terrifying force of his fortune and his will. He launched what can only be described as a private war against the British state. He hired a team of former intelligence officers, forensic experts, and relentless lawyers. He spent millions of dollars, tens of millions, funding his own parallel investigation. And in February of 1998, he dropped the bombshell that would define the entire conspiracy for the next decade. He publicly accused the British security services, acting on the orders of the royal family, of murdering Diana and his son. And he didn't just vaguely gesture towards the monarchy. He named a name: Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the patriarch of the House of Windsor. According to Al-Fayed, Prince Philip was a racist who could not stand the idea of the mother of the future King of England marrying a Muslim. He claimed Philip orchestrated the hit, using MI6 as his personal assassins. It was an accusation so audacious, so beyond the pale, that it was initially dismissed as the ravings of a heartbroken man. But Al-Fayed wasn't just raving. He was building a case, piece by painstaking piece, and presenting it to the court of public opinion. His investigators began re-examining every shred of evidence, and they started finding things. Or at least things that looked like evidence. First, there was the mysterious white Fiat Uno. The French investigators confirmed that the Mercedes had a glancing collision with a white Fiat Uno in the tunnel, just before it spun out of control. They found paint scrapings on the Mercedes's mirror. The driver of that Fiat never came forward. For the French police, it was a frustrating loose end. For Al-Fayed's team, it was proof of a second vehicle, a vehicle used to force the Mercedes off the road. They eventually found a potential owner, a French security guard and part-time paparazzi named James Ananson. Ananson owned a white Fiat Uno that matched the description, but he had an alibi. He claimed he was at home, hundreds of miles away, on the night of the crash. The police checked it out and cleared him, but Al-Fayed's team dug deeper. They alleged that Ananson was no mere photographer. They claimed he was a low-level informant for the security services. And here's where it gets truly chilling. In May of 2000, James Ananson was found dead in a burned-out car in the French countryside. The official verdict was suicide. Fayed called it a cleanup operation. The man who knew too much, he claimed, had been silenced. Then there was the flash of light. Tomlinson's blueprint had mentioned a high-powered strobe light to disorient the driver. And now witnesses were coming forward. Multiple people who were near the Pont El Alma tunnel that night reported seeing a brilliant, blinding flash of light just moments before the sound of the crash. French police dismissed it as camera flashes from the paparazzi, but some witnesses were adamant. They said it wasn't a camera flash, it was something different, something far more intense. Was this the MI6 weapon in action? The very tool Tomlinson had described? For millions of people, the connection was too perfect to be a coincidence. But the central pillar of the official story, and the primary target of Fayed's attack, was the driver Henri Paul. The investigation concluded he was drunk, with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, and had been driving at over 100 miles per hour. Case closed. But Fayed refused to accept it. He insisted Henri Paul was not a drunk. Staff at the Ritz who saw him that night swore he was sober. Security footage of him in the hotel lobby just minutes before he got behind the wheel doesn't show a man who is visibly intoxicated. So what about the blood tests? Fayed's investigators made a shocking claim. The blood samples were not Henri Paul's. They alleged the samples had been switched or contaminated to frame a dead man. They pointed to dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide found in the blood, levels so high they argued Paul would have been barely conscious, let alone able to walk and drive. The French authorities explained this away as contamination from the body's retrieval, but the doubt had been planted, and it went deeper. Henri Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, was a man with a modest salary. Yet, in the year leading up to his death, he had amassed a personal fortune of over $200,000, held in more than a dozen separate bank accounts. He also had thousands of dollars in cash on him the night he died. Where did all this money come from? The official explanation was that he had personal sources. Fayed provided a more sinister one. Henri Paul was in the pay of a security service. He was an informant. MI6, the French DGSE, maybe both. He wasn't a drunk driver who lost control. He was an intelligence asset who was part of the plot, willingly or not, to lead Diana and Dodi to their deaths. With every new claim, Fayed was systematically dismantling the official narrative. He was replacing a simple story of a tragic accident with a complex, terrifying story of a state-sponsored execution. The media, at first dismissive, now couldn't ignore him. He was a constant presence, holding press conferences, giving interviews, feeding reporters a steady stream of documents and allegations. He was turning public opinion. People started to wonder, could he be right? Could the British establishment, the very people who seemed so prim and proper, be capable of such a monstrous act? But to believe that, you needed more than just a method. You needed a motive. Why would they do it? Why would Prince Philip and the royal family want Diana dead? It was a question Fayed was more than ready to answer. And his answer would be the most controversial, the most explosive, and the most personal claim of all. He alleged that Diana was not just in love with his son, she was pregnant with his child. And on the night they died, Dodi was going to ask her to marry him. The proof, he said, was a stunning diamond engagement ring he had picked up from a jeweler in Paris that very day. A ring that was later recovered from the wreckage. A marriage was one thing, but a pregnancy? The mother of the future King of England, pregnant with the child of a Muslim man? A child who would be the half-sibling of Prince William, the heir to the throne? To Fayed, this wasn't just something the royal family would find distasteful. It was something they would find intolerable. It was a threat to the purity of the bloodline, a crisis that could shake the monarchy to its very foundations. And it was, he screamed from the rooftops, the one thing that would make them turn from disapproval to murder. To Mohammed Fayed, this wasn't just a theory. It was the gospel truth, a truth he would spend the rest of his life and a fortune trying to prove. The motive in his eyes was built on two explosive pillars: a ring and a baby, a royal engagement to a Muslim, and a royal baby who would be half Egyptian. Together they formed a narrative so powerful, so threatening to the establishment, that it signed his son's death warrant. Let's start with the ring. The story, as Fayed told it, is the stuff of fairy tales. On their final day together, August 30th, 1997, Dodi and Diana were captured on CCTV footage at a jeweler in Paris. Not just any jeweler, but Rapazzi, a high-end store whose owner was a friend of Dodi's. They were looking at a specific collection, a collection called Dis-moi oui, French for "tell me yes." It was a collection of engagement rings. Later that day, Dodi returned to the store alone and purchased a spectacular diamond ring from that very collection. The price tag? Over $200,000. The receipt was later found in his apartment, a silent testament to his intentions. For Fayed, the case was closed. This was the ring Dodi was going to place on Diana's finger that very night at his lavish Paris apartment. The paparazzi were a nuisance, yes, but the real reason for the frantic, high-speed departure from the Ritz wasn't just to dodge cameras. It was to get back to the privacy of Dodi's home, where he could get down on one knee and ask the most famous woman in the world to be his wife. A proposal that would have sent shockwaves through the British establishment. It's a perfect story. Romantic, tragic, and it provides a rock-solid foundation for a motive. But like so much in this case, when you look closer, the perfect story begins to fray at the edges. The British investigation, Operation Paget, spent years and millions of pounds investigating every single claim, and they dug deep into the story of the ring. What they found tells a different story. The jeweler Alberto Rapazzi did confirm that Dodi and Diana visited his store, but his testimony changed over time. Initially, he said they were just looking. Years later, his story evolved to claim Dodi had ordered a specific engagement ring. More damning, however, was the testimony from Diana's own inner circle. Her closest friends, women like Rosa Monckton and her sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, were adamant. Diana was not planning to marry Dodi. In fact, they said the relationship was little more than a summer fling, a way to have fun and make her ex-lover, Hasnat Khan, jealous. Rosa Monckton, who had been on holiday with Diana just 2 weeks before her death, was explicit. She said Diana had no intention of marrying Dodi, and was still deeply heartbroken over her breakup with Khan. When asked about a ring, Diana had apparently told her friends, "If I get a ring from Dodi, it's going on a finger on my right hand. A friendship ring, perhaps. A thank you for a wonderful summer. But an engagement ring?" Her own friends and family said absolutely not. The ring was recovered from Dodi's apartment after the crash. It was never given to Diana. The proposal Fayed imagined never happened. But even if the engagement was a fantasy, the second pillar of his argument was far more potent. Because a ring can be misinterpreted, pregnancy cannot. Mohammed Fayed was unshakable in his belief. Princess Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child. He claimed that in their final phone call, just hours before the crash, Diana had shared the joyous, secret news with him. A new baby, a brother or sister for William and Harry, a child who would be the grandchild of Mohammed Fayed, and whose stepfather would one day be the King of England. Imagine the implications. The future King of England's mother, having a child with an Egyptian Muslim, the royal bloodline, that sacred protected institution, forever altered. To Fayed, this wasn't just a scandal. It was an existential threat to the House of Windsor. It was, without question, the ultimate motive for murder. He pointed to Diana's demeanor in her final weeks. Paparazzi photos showed her on Dodi's yacht, hand resting on her stomach. Was it a conscious, protective gesture? Tabloids had been running speculative, "Is Diana pregnant?" headlines for weeks. Fayed seized on this, claiming it was all true, and that the intelligence services, specifically MI6, knew it. They had her under surveillance, he claimed. They were listening to her calls. Once they heard the news, the plot was set in motion. The order came down from the very top, from the shadows of Buckingham Palace, to eliminate the problem before it became public. This is the single most explosive claim in the entire constellation of conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death. And if true, it changes everything. But was it? Again, Operation Paget dedicated immense resources to finding the answer. They had access to medical records, forensic evidence, and witness testimony that the public had never seen. And their conclusion was unequivocal. There was not a shred of evidence to support the claim that Princess Diana was pregnant. First, the science. Blood samples were taken from the wreckage of the Mercedes, from stains on the carpet and seats. These samples were tested for HCG, the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, the telltale sign of pregnancy. The results were negative. There was no HCG present. Diana was not pregnant. Conspiracy theorists immediately countered. The samples could have been switched or contaminated, but the chain of custody was proven to be secure. Then there was the issue of the embalming. Diana's body was partially embalmed in Paris before being returned to the UK. Fayed and his supporters claimed this was a deliberate act of sabotage, a chemical cover-up designed to destroy any evidence of a fetus during the British autopsy. It sounds sinister, but the reality, according to the authorities, was far more mundane. Embalming is standard procedure in France for a body being repatriated, especially when there will be an open casket viewing for the family, as there was for Diana. The French authorities saw no reason to perform a full autopsy in Paris, as the cause of death, massive internal injuries from a high-speed car crash, was tragically obvious. They were simply preparing her body with dignity for its journey home. Furthermore, the world-renowned pathologist who conducted the British autopsy, Dr. Robert Chapman, stated under oath that while the embalming made his job more difficult, it would not have hidden or destroyed the evidence of a pregnancy. He looked for physical signs in the uterus and found none. He was certain she was not pregnant. But the most powerful rebuttal didn't come from a lab or a coroner's table. It came once again from Diana's closest friend, Rosa Monckton. In a deeply personal and poignant testimony to the official inquest, she revealed something that silenced the speculation. She had been on a 10-day holiday with Diana in Greece just before Diana flew to Paris to be with Dodi. During that holiday, Rosa confirmed Diana had her period. It was a simple biological fact that made a pregnancy at the time of her death a virtual impossibility. The twin pillars of Mohammed Al-Fayed's grand conspiracy, the very motive he believed led to his son's murder, had crumbled under the weight of evidence. No engagement, no pregnancy, just a grieving father's desperate search for a reason, any reason, for a loss so profound it defied explanation. But the collapse of the motive did not collapse his resolve. If the why was wrong, he would simply have to focus on the how. Because if the royal family didn't order her death because she was pregnant, that didn't mean they hadn't ordered her death for other reasons. Or that another, even more shadowy organization, had their own reasons for wanting the princess silenced. The focus of the conspiracy would now shift, moving from the palaces of London to the dark, unforgiving concrete of the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, and the mysterious figures who were there in the shadows, waiting. The first official reports to reach the public were simple, tragic, and clean. A drunk driver, a high-speed chase, a terrible accident. But for those who were actually there, in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the crash, the story was anything but simple. It was a scene of twisted metal and flashing lights, but also of strange inconsistencies and figures who didn't fit. Figures who seemed to melt back into the Parisian night as quickly as they had appeared. The first and most enduring of these phantoms is the white Fiat Uno. Within hours of the crash, investigators noticed something odd on the mangled black Mercedes: scrapes of white paint. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The Mercedes had made contact with the white Fiat Uno just before or during the crash. This wasn't just a minor detail. For many, this was the smoking gun. A second vehicle, a mystery car, was directly involved. Eyewitnesses, a couple named Georges and Sabine Dazan, reported seeing a white Fiat Uno swerving erratically out of the tunnel moments after the crash. They described the driver as looking agitated and focused, and they noticed a broken tail light and a dog, a large dark dog, in the back. The French police launched a massive search for this car, testing over 5,000 white Fiat Unos in the country. But the car and its driver seemed to have vanished into thin air. That is, until a name surfaced: James Ananson. Ananson was a French photojournalist, a paparazzo, who happened to own a white Fiat Uno. Ananson had a reputation for being relentless, for getting the impossible shot. He had been one of the photographers who had hounded Diana and Dodi throughout their final summer. And when police finally located his car months later, it had been resprayed. The tail light had been replaced. Ananson claimed he had been at his home, hundreds of miles away from Paris, on the night of the crash. His family and friends provided an alibi, but the questions lingered. Why the new paint job? Why the new tail light? And Anson's story takes an even darker turn. He was known to have connections, shadowy connections, to French and British intelligence services. It was rumored he worked as an informant, trading information for access. This wasn't your average photographer. This was a man who moved in dangerous circles. Could he have been the driver? Not as a paparazzo trying to get a picture, but as an operative with a far more sinister mission? Was his role to clip the Mercedes to destabilize it, setting it up for the final fatal impact against the 13th pillar of the Ponte El Alma tunnel? The official investigation, Operation Paget, eventually concluded that while Ananson was a person of interest, there was no concrete evidence placing him in the tunnel that night. But then, in May of 2000, James Ananson was found dead in his burned-out car in a remote forest in the south of France. The car doors were locked from the inside. The authorities ruled it a suicide, but those close to him were deeply suspicious. His friends said he was not a man who would take his own life. They pointed to the fact that his car keys were found in his pocket, not in the ignition, and a second set of keys was never recovered. Most chillingly, forensic reports showed 2 holes in his skull, holes his family's lawyer claimed were consistent with bullet wounds. Was this the suicide of a guilt-ridden man? Or was this the work of a professional cleanup crew, silencing a loose end? But the white Fiat Uno wasn't the only ghost in the tunnel that night. Multiple witnesses, including some of the first on the scene, reported something else. Something faster, more aggressive. A powerful, dark-colored motorcycle carrying 2 people, which had been seen weaving through traffic, chasing the Mercedes at breakneck speed. Francois Levister, who was driving just ahead of the princess's car, gave a terrifying account. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw the motorcycle pull up alongside the Mercedes. And then he saw a brilliant, blinding flash of light emanate from the back of the bike, aimed directly at the driver's side of the car. He described it as a light so intense it was like a police radar flash, but much, much bigger. A split second later, Levister heard the screech of tires and the deafening boom of the Mercedes slamming into the pillar. His testimony was initially dismissed by French authorities as unreliable, but he wasn't alone. Other witnesses reported seeing a similar flash. This wasn't the scattered, popping flashes of paparazzi cameras. This was a single, powerful, debilitating blast of light. The theory was immediate and chilling. Henri Paul hadn't just lost control. He had been deliberately blinded. This theory might sound like something out of a spy movie, but it gained terrifying credibility from an unlikely source. A former MI6 agent named Richard Tomlinson. Tomlinson, who had been dismissed from the British intelligence service, came forward with an explosive claim. He stated that while he was with MI6, he had seen a proposal for the assassination of the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic. The plan was almost identical to the events in the Ponte El Alma tunnel. The proposal detailed using a high-powered strobe light, a laser gun, to blind the driver of Milosevic's limousine as it passed through a tunnel in Geneva, causing a fatal crash that would look like a tragic accident. Tomlinson swore he saw this document. He believed the same elite MI6 unit tasked with that assassination was responsible for Diana's death. He even identified one of the agents he believed was involved, a man who, coincidentally, was a known motorcycle enthusiast. When Tomlinson's claims became public, MI6 was forced to admit that such a plan had, in fact, been considered. They claimed it was just a proposal, a theoretical exercise that was never approved. But the admission itself was a bombshell. The top intelligence agency in the United Kingdom had a playbook for political assassination that perfectly mirrored the death of the Princess of Wales. Suddenly, the pieces start to form a terrifying mosaic. You have a phantom white Fiat Uno, potentially driven by a paparazzo with intelligence ties, to initiate the loss of control. You have a high-speed motorcycle carrying 2 shadowy figures. You have multiple witnesses who saw a blinding flash of light, consistent with a specialized weapon. And you have a former MI6 agent confirming the existence of a top-secret assassination protocol that uses that exact method. This paints a picture not of a simple car chase, but of a sophisticated multi-stage ambush. A pincer movement in the dark. The paparazzi were the perfect cover. Amidst the chaos of a dozen flashing cameras, who would notice the one flash that mattered? The one that wasn't meant to take a picture but to take a life. The pursuers could hide in plain sight, their motorcycles and cameras making them indistinguishable from the pack of photographers they were embedded with. They were wolves in sheep's clothing. The official narrative tells us that Henri Paul, drunk and on antidepressants, was solely responsible for the crash. But the evidence from inside the tunnel suggests a far more complex and sinister sequence of events. It suggests that external forces were at play, actively working to ensure the Mercedes never made it out of that tunnel intact. The crash itself was violent, horrific, and chaotic. But for the people who may have planned it, it was only phase one. The goal wasn't just to cause a crash. The goal was to ensure Diana did not survive. And as the princess lay critically injured in the wreckage, a new and equally disturbing chapter of the night was just beginning. The clock was ticking on what doctors call the golden hour, the critical window of time to save a trauma patient's life. But as we'll see, the response of the emergency services on the scene was anything but urgent. In fact, it was so slow, so bizarrely inefficient, that many believe the delay itself was the final fatal part of the plan. The first person to officially render aid to Princess Diana was not a paramedic. It was an off-duty doctor named Frederick Mayles, who happened to be driving through the tunnel in the opposite direction. He saw the smoke, the wreckage, and did what any doctor would do. He ran to help. He found Diana slumped on the floor in the back of the Mercedes, conscious but in a state of shock. He noted she had no visible, catastrophic bleeding from her head or face. She was agitated, repeating the words, "Oh my God, oh my God." Dr. Mayles, not recognizing her, focused on his patient. He retrieved a respiratory bag from his car and began assisting her breathing, all while waiting for the emergency services he assumed were just moments away. In his professional opinion, while she was seriously injured, her condition was not immediately hopeless. She was alive, she was breathing, and for a moment it seemed she had a fighting chance. But then the official response began, and the clock of the golden hour started to tick away with agonizing slowness. The first police officers were on the scene within minutes. Then, the first SAMU ambulance arrived, France's elite emergency medical unit. And this is where the official story begins to unravel. The scene inside that tunnel was one of chaos, but the response was one of strange, almost lethargic deliberation. The first priority in any major trauma case is extrication, getting the patient out of the wreckage and into an ambulance. Yet, Diana remained inside the mangled Mercedes for an incredibly long time. The official explanation is that the French medical philosophy of stay and play dictated that they treat the patient extensively at the scene before transport, and that they feared a spinal injury, requiring a slow, meticulous removal. But let's be clear. It took the paramedics over an hour to get Princess Diana out of that car. An hour. Think about that. A patient with massive, suspected internal injuries, and the medical team spent 60 minutes on the scene before even placing her in the ambulance. Veteran trauma surgeons and paramedics from the United States and the UK have looked at this timeline in disbelief. They call it inexplicable. The scoop and run protocol, standard in most of the world, exists for a reason. You cannot perform surgery in the street. The single most important factor for a patient bleeding internally is getting them to an operating table. Every second wasted is a drop of blood loss that can never be recovered. Even by the standards of stay and play, the delay was extreme. Dr. Mayles himself later expressed his astonishment at how long it took. He, the first doctor on scene, had stabilized her breathing. The critical need was transport. Yet she waited, and waited. Finally, at 1:40 a.m., more than an hour and a half after the crash, the ambulance carrying Princess Diana finally pulled away from the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The destination was the Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital, roughly 4 miles away. In the dead of night, with a police escort clearing the way, that journey should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Took over 40. The ambulance traveled at what witnesses described as a funereal pace, averaging less than 10 miles per hour. This is perhaps the single most damning and inexplicable fact in the entire tragedy. Why would an ambulance, carrying one of the most famous women in the world who was critically injured, drive so slowly? The official reason given was that Diana's blood pressure was dangerously unstable, and any sudden movements or acceleration could have been fatal. The doctors on board were trying to keep her alive, and a slow, steady journey was deemed the safest option. But again, this explanation clashes violently with the fundamental principles of emergency medicine. If a patient's blood pressure is crashing, it's a sign of one thing: catastrophic internal bleeding. The only solution is surgery. The treatment is a hospital. The idea of driving slowly to prevent her condition from worsening is like trying to outrun a tidal wave by walking. The problem isn't the speed of the vehicle. It's the hemorrhage raging inside the patient's body. The only thing that could save her was a surgeon's scalpel, and every minute the ambulance crawled through the streets of Paris, her chances of reaching that surgeon alive were plummeting. And then the journey gets even stranger. At 2:05 a.m., just a few hundred yards from the hospital's entrance, the ambulance pulled over. It stopped. For 5 full minutes, the ambulance sat motionless, its precious cargo bleeding to death inside. The official report states that Diana went into cardiac arrest, and the medical team had to stop to administer adrenaline and perform emergency procedures. This stop is the smoking gun for many investigators. Think about the logic. You are less than a minute's drive from one of the best hospitals in Paris. A full trauma team is scrubbed in and waiting. All the equipment, all the blood, all the surgeons you could possibly need are 30 seconds away. And you choose to stop the vehicle to perform a complex medical intervention in the cramped, poorly lit confines of the back of an ambulance? It makes no sense. The most logical, the most urgent, the most medically sound decision would have been to hit the accelerator and cover that final short distance to the hospital doors. No experienced paramedic would choose to stop in the field when the emergency room is literally within sight. When you add it all up, the picture becomes deeply disturbing. An hour to get her out of the car. 40 minutes to travel 4 miles. A 5-minute stop just outside the hospital. From the moment of the crash at 12:23 a.m. to her arrival at the hospital at 2:06 a.m., a total of 1 hour and 43 minutes had passed. A medical eternity. The golden hour wasn't just missed, it was ignored. It was squandered with a series of decisions that, to many medical experts, look less like professional caution and more like gross, almost criminal negligence. Was this a tragic comedy of errors? A case of a medical team completely out of its depth and making one catastrophic mistake after another? Or was the delay the point? If you wanted to ensure Diana didn't survive, you wouldn't need a second crash or a hidden gunman. All you would need to do is control the clock. All you would need is to turn a 10-minute ambulance ride into a 40-minute procession. You would just have to let time, and the unstoppable physics of internal bleeding, do the work for you. The delay wasn't just a contributing factor to her death. It's possible the delay was the murder weapon. But the questions don't stop with the timeline. They extend to the destination itself. The Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital was a world-class facility, no doubt. But it wasn't the closest hospital to the crash site. There were other nearer trauma centers. So why was this specific hospital chosen? The decision to take her there, combined with the bizarrely slow journey, has led some to believe the choice of hospital was just as calculated as the delay itself. The Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital. On paper, a world-class facility, but in the context of that night, it was a death sentence delivered by delay. The official explanation is that the doctors on scene, Dr. Lugiesi and Dr. Martino, chose it because it had the specific surgical teams and equipment she needed. They claimed they were preparing her for the inevitable surgery she would require upon arrival. But this explanation crumbles under scrutiny. The first-hand accounts of the paramedics paint a picture of a team that was not preparing for surgery, but simply waiting. Waiting for instructions. Waiting for time to pass. The journey itself took an hour and 40 minutes from the crash site to the hospital doors. A distance of just 4 miles. Even with a stop, that speed is unjustifiable in a life-or-death emergency. It's as if the objective was not to save a life, but to manage a death. But to truly understand the events of that night, we have to rewind. Back to the moments just before the Mercedes entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Because the car wasn't just being chased by paparazzi on motorcycles. According to multiple eyewitnesses, something else was there. Something that officially, for a long time, didn't exist. A small white Fiat Uno. French couple Georges and Sabine Dazan were driving ahead of the Mercedes. They saw it in their rearview mirror, swerving violently. But they also saw the Fiat Uno, driving erratically, blocking the Mercedes' path inside the tunnel. Another witness, Francois Levister, who was driving just in front of the Mercedes, claimed he was overtaken by the Fiat, and saw a bright, disorienting flash of light emanate from it just as Diana's car entered the tunnel. He described it as a flash so powerful it could paralyze a bull. After the crash, Levister saw a man get out of the Fiat, look into the wrecked Mercedes, make a gesture that he interpreted as mission accomplished, and then speed away. 4 years, the Fiat Uno was a ghost, a phantom vehicle dismissed by investigators. But the evidence was literally scraped onto the side of the Mercedes, paint from a white Fiat Uno, and fragments from its tail light. Eventually, authorities identified the car as belonging to a security guard and part-time paparazzi named James Anson. Anson owned a white Fiat Uno that matched the description. He was a known paparazzi with connections to French intelligence. He had a history of being in the right place at the right time. But when questioned, he provided a flimsy alibi, claiming he was at home, 175 miles away. Police never searched his car. A few years later, in the year 2000, Anson's body was found in a burned-out car in a remote forest in France. The doors were locked from the outside. He had 2 bullet holes in his head. The official verdict? Suicide. Another man, a Vietnamese-born French citizen named Le Van Tan, was also identified as a possible driver. He owned a white Fiat Uno and admitted to being in the tunnel that night, but denied any involvement. He claimed he repainted his car red just hours after the crash to avoid trouble. When Mohammed Al-Fayed's legal team tried to interview him, he claimed French police had told him to shut his mouth. To this day, the identity of the driver of the Fiat Uno, the car that may have initiated the fatal crash, remains a fiercely debated mystery. Was it a random paparazzi? Or was it an operative, tasked with causing the Mercedes to swerve, using a powerful strobe light to blind the driver at the critical moment? And that brings us to the driver himself, Henri Paul, the man officially blamed for the entire tragedy. The story is simple. He was the head of security at the Ritz, he was drunk, he was speeding, and he lost control. Case closed. But the case of Henri Paul is anything but closed. The official blood test showed he had a blood alcohol level more than 3 times the French legal limit. He was, by that metric, dangerously intoxicated. But his friends, his family, and his own doctor vehemently disagreed. They said he was a moderate, social drinker at best, and his doctor, who had seen him for a checkup just days before, stated he showed no signs of alcoholism. So where did the alcohol come from? When a second independent test was demanded, the results were even more bizarre. They confirmed the high alcohol level, but they also found something else. An impossibly high level of carbon monoxide in his blood, a 20.7% saturation, a level that, according to toxicologists, would have made it physically impossible for him to even stand up and walk, let alone drive a car at high speed through Paris. It's a level of poisoning usually only seen in suicide victims or people who have died in a fire. Henri Paul had done neither. This has led to a chilling theory, that the blood samples tested were not his at all, that they were swapped with the blood of a suicide victim who had a similar name, to create a convenient narrative and a perfect scapegoat. Then there was the money. In the year leading up to his death, Henri Paul's personal bank account saw deposits totaling over 170,000 British pounds, nearly $250,000, far more than his $35,000 year salary could account for. He also had over $1,500 in cash on him the night he died. Where did this money come from? The official explanation is that it was savings and personal funds, but many investigators, including those hired by Mohammed Al-Fayed, believe Henri Paul was not just a security chief. They believe he was a paid informant, a security asset for not one, but 2 intelligence agencies, Britain's MI6 and France's DGSE. Was he being paid to provide information on Diana's movements? Was he a willing participant in a plan that went wrong? Or was he a pawn set up to take the fall from the very beginning? His death ensured he could never tell his side of the story. With the driver dead and discredited, the focus shifted entirely away from the possibility of foul play. But the biggest questions, the ones that point most directly to a conspiracy, arose in the hours after Diana was pronounced dead. Because Diana may have been carrying a secret so monumental it could have shaken the British monarchy to its very foundations. For weeks, the tabloids had been running rampant with speculation that Diana was pregnant with Dodi Fayed's child. Dodi had told his family he was planning to propose. He had purchased a stunning diamond engagement ring from a Parisian jeweler just hours before the crash. Friends of Diana later came forward to say she had hinted at a happy surprise. For the British establishment, the thought of the mother of the future King of England being engaged to an Egyptian Muslim was a public relations nightmare. But the thought of her bearing his child, a Muslim half-sibling to the future King William, was considered an existential threat. It was, in their eyes, completely unacceptable. Mohammed Al-Fayed has always been adamant that Diana was pregnant. He claimed that in their final phone call, Dodi had confirmed it. This claim has been officially denied and dismissed as the ramblings of a grieving father. But if it were true, it would provide the single most powerful motive for murder. The question is, how could you ever prove it? A simple blood test during an autopsy would have revealed the pregnancy hormones. But that test never happened, because French authorities, in a move that defied medical protocol, legal precedent, and common sense, made a shocking decision. Within hours of her death, and before any formal autopsy could be performed by British officials, Princess Diana's body was embalmed. Embalming is a chemical process. It floods the body with formaldehyde and other chemicals to preserve it. In doing so, it completely destroys the body's natural blood chemistry. It makes toxicological and hormonal testing impossible. It erases the very evidence that could have proven a pregnancy. The official reason given was to prepare her body for viewing by Prince Charles and her sisters, who were flying to Paris. But this is an incredibly weak justification. Embalming is not required for viewing, especially not within such a short time frame. Furthermore, it was a direct violation of French law, which requires a judicial order for the embalming of any person who has died an unnatural death. No such order was ever produced. Someone somewhere gave an order that ensured the single most important piece of evidence about Diana's physical state, the potential motive for her murder, was chemically obliterated before her body ever left French soil. The question of her pregnancy was rendered permanently unanswerable, a fatal secret, taken to the grave and sealed there by formaldehyde. And with that single irreversible act, a crucial piece of the puzzle was lost forever. Or was it deliberately removed? This question sits at the very heart of the labyrinth we've spent 9 parts navigating. The death of Diana, Princess of Wales, was presented to the world as a tragic, senseless accident. A story of a drunk driver, a reckless chase, and a fatal mistake. But as we've seen, peeling back even a single layer of that official narrative reveals a tangled web of inconsistencies, contradictions, and events so statistically improbable they beggar belief. Let's re-examine the chain of events, not as a random sequence, but as a potential blueprint. A last-minute change of plans sends Diana and Dodi into a decoy car, down a different route, with a driver whose security credentials and sobriety have been fiercely debated. A driver who, according to multiple witnesses, was not driving erratically until the final moments in the Pont El Alma tunnel. The crucial CCTV cameras covering their entire route, all 10 of them, somehow malfunctioned at the exact same time. A mysterious dark car, likely the infamous Fiat Uno, collides with their Mercedes and vanishes into thin air, never to be definitively identified, its driver never found. Then comes the moment of impact. Multiple, credible witnesses, including French police officers, report a brilliant, blinding flash of light just before the crash. A light so intense it was described as being like a police camera flash, but 100 times more powerful. This aligns chillingly with the testimony of Richard Tomlinson, a former MI6 officer, who swore under oath that he had seen plans for a nearly identical assassination plot. A plot to kill a foreign leader by using a powerful strobe light in a tunnel to disorient the driver and cause a fatal crash. Tomlinson claimed the agent who drafted that plan was the same agent he knew was active in Paris at the time of Diana's death. Coincidence? In the crash's immediate aftermath, the chaos only deepens. Dr. Frederick Maylis, the first doctor on the scene, arrives by pure chance. He reports that Diana is alive, injured but stable. He says she will survive. Yet, the official ambulance takes over an hour and 40 minutes to transport her a mere 3.5 miles to a hospital. An inexplicable, fatal delay in a city with world-class emergency services. In Paris, the golden hour, the critical window for treating trauma patients, was squandered. And finally, the ultimate act of evidentiary destruction, the premature and, according to British royal protocol, highly irregular embalming. An act that permanently erased any possibility of verifying the one thing that would have provided the most powerful motive of all, the rumored pregnancy. A child who would have been a Muslim, and a half-sibling to the future King of England. So we are left with 2 starkly different realities. The first is the official story. This reality asks you to believe in a cascade of unbelievable bad luck. It asks you to accept that a security-conscious billionaire and a princess, both acutely aware of the threats against them, would place their lives in the hands of a drunk driver. That every single security camera on their route would fail at once. That a phantom car could strike them and disappear without a trace. that a blinding flash of light was a mass hallucination, that a world-class ambulance service would inexplicably fail in its most basic duties, and that the highly unusual decision to embalm Diana's body was a simple, innocent mistake. In this reality, the death of Princess Diana is a tragedy built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated coincidence. But there is a second reality, a darker one. This reality suggests that nothing was a coincidence, that every anomaly was a deliberate piece of a meticulously planned operation. In this reality, Diana wasn't just a celebrity. She was a threat to the British monarchy, the so-called firm. She was the divorced, wildly popular people's princess, who was on the verge of marrying a Muslim man, Dodi Fayed. Mohammed al-Fayed, Dodi's father, insisted until the day he died that they were engaged, and that Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child. Imagine the implications. The mother of the future King of England, married to a Muslim. The future king himself, having a Muslim stepfather and half-sibling. To a 1,000-year-old institution, an establishment built on tradition and the Anglican Church, this was not just a scandal. It was an existential crisis. Prince Philip's own letters to Diana, which he described to friends as abusive and threatening, hint at the deep-seated animosity within the palace walls. Was Diana's happiness a price the establishment was unwilling to pay? In this second reality, the motive is clear: to neutralize the threat she posed. The method? An assassination disguised as a drunk driving accident. A wet-up. In intelligence terms, the blinding flash in the tunnel wasn't a hallucination. It was the weapon. The compromised driver Henri Paul wasn't just a drunk. He was an asset, a man with ties to French and British intelligence services and unexplained thousands of dollars in his bank accounts. The slow ambulance wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated delay to ensure the target did not survive her injuries. The missing CCTV footage wasn't a glitch. It was erased. The phantom Fiat Uno wasn't a ghost. It was a tool, used to nudge the Mercedes into the 13th pillar and then disappear, its mission accomplished. And the embalming wasn't a mistake. It was the final critical step to conceal the primary motive, to bury the secret of a potential royal pregnancy deep in the earth along with Diana's body. This reality also considers another powerful enemy Diana had made: the global arms industry. In the final months of her life, Diana had become the world's most famous advocate for a global ban on landmines. She wasn't just posing for photos. She was walking through minefields, comforting victims, and using her immense platform to lobby governments. She was single-handedly turning public opinion against a $100 billion a year industry, an industry with deep ties to intelligence agencies and governments, an industry that has never been shy about eliminating its opponents. Was Diana's crusade for humanity seen as an unacceptable threat to their profits? So where does that leave us? With a choice between staggering coincidence and chilling conspiracy, between a simple accident and a state-sponsored execution. The official inquiries in both France and Britain concluded it was an accident, a gross negligence manslaughter. But they left countless questions unanswered, dismissed key witnesses, and ignored glaring inconsistencies. They gave us an answer that was neat, tidy, and comfortable. An answer that protected the powerful. But the truth is rarely so simple. The truth is that Diana was a woman who lived her life under the microscope of the establishment, and she died in the darkness of a Paris tunnel, surrounded by shadows and secrets. The sheer number of anomalies defies the laws of probability. The motives, both dynastic and financial, were terrifyingly real. We may never know with absolute certainty what happened in the Ponte El Alma tunnel on that August night. The people who know the full story are either dead or will take that secret to their graves. But the questions remain because the official story just doesn't add up. It asks us to believe in a perfect storm of misfortune that strains credulity to its breaking point. Perhaps the final question isn't whether it was an accident or an assassination. Perhaps the real question is, why do we still care so much? We care because Diana was more than a princess. She was a disruptor. She challenged a rigid, ancient institution. She used her voice to speak for the voiceless. She showed empathy in a world that often felt cold and cynical. She was a force of nature who was beloved by millions, precisely because she was flawed, human, and real. And that is why she was so dangerous to the powers that be. Whether it was the monarchy, the intelligence services, or the arms trade, she had a unique ability to connect with people and shift public opinion in a way that terrified them. Her death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the silencing of a powerful voice. And the lingering suspicion that she was murdered is a testament to the power she wielded and the fear she inspired. The story of her death is the final, tragic chapter in the story of her life. A life spent fighting against an establishment that could never truly control her, and in the end may have decided to stop her for good.